All right, grade 11. So here we are doing lesson number 11, but carbon cycling, S-cells and H-cells. We are back together to talk about topic 4. So this is 4.3 carbon cycling. Most of this you will be going through today. Some of this you will be kind of cementing your understanding tomorrow with an online simulation assignment that will be graded that you'll be working on. And then we'll come back to this when we talk about 4.4 and climate change, kind of connect these all together. Okay, so if you have any questions, again, please email me. I will try to talk slower. I know Sabrina told me today I'm talking too fast sometimes, so I'll try to slow it down for you guys. And thank you for the feedback. Okay, so we're going to be talking about autotrophs, converting carbon dioxide into carbs, and other carbon compounds, of course, connecting to topic 4.1, 4.2, talking about ecology, about how we have carbon dioxide in aquatic ecosystems as well as terrestrial. We can talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or water into the autotrophs. We can talk about carbon dioxide produced by respiration. Okay, and so that's topic 2, and diffusing out of organisms into water or the atmosphere. So when we draw our carbon cycle diagram today, which will be part of today's lesson, you'll be connecting all those things. Talk about methane, how it's produced, and how it's oxidized to carbon dioxide. Talk about formation of peat as one fossil fuel, and other fossil fuels should be coal, oil, or gas. Talk about combustion of biomass and fossil fuels to release carbon dioxide. We're talking about carbon in the ocean with reef-building corals and mollusks. The applications, one is estimation of carbon fluxes due to processes in the carbon cycle. We'll do a little bit of that today and more of it later on in the unit. Air monitoring station data, we'll be doing that later on in the unit, and the carbon cycle diagram, we will be doing that today. It's our kind of final task for today. Okay, so let's start with the carbon cycle. Now, you probably have already heard of this in earlier grades, grade 9 and grade 10, or even middle school, talk about the carbon cycle. A lot of people talk about it as the carbon dioxide oxygen cycle, as when animals respire, we breathe out carbon dioxide, we breathe in oxygen, and when plants photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, and that balance as being something really key. So this topic is one that sometimes students tend to underestimate. So please be very careful and make sure that when you're talking about this in the context of this course of the IBO, you are aware of the following things. So in the biosphere, you're talking about aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems both. A lot of times, like in this diagram, it mostly focuses on the terrestrial, a little bit about ocean here, but you have to talk about both organisms in both cases, not just one or the other. Carbon in the atmosphere, carbon in the hydrosphere, so in the water, so often neglected, fossil fuels, biofuels, and sequestration, which is storage of carbon. So it's a good list to kind of keep track of when you're drawing your models and analyzing the carbon cycle, which we feel with a simulation later on this week, to make sure you're doing all of those parts. And then it helps you just avoid forgetting anything important. Okay, so before we get into the carbon cycle, it's important to kind of review our chemistry. So you who are taking chemistry this year, a bit of a leg up on this unit, on this part of this unit anyway. I'm talking about different compounds. So we have carbon dioxide gas, of course, a very carbon compound that's really important for climate change. And carbon dioxide, when it's dissolved in water, here's a water molecule around that CO2 molecule. We have methane gas, CH4. We have different hydrocarbons in oil and gas, so fossil fuels. We have carbohydrates like glucose, like starch, like sucrose, cellulose, all those carbohydrates. Hydrogen carbonate ions are really important in the ocean. Peat, which will be rich organic carbon molecules, like this one, really big molecules have a lot of carbon in them. And then we have carbonates, which are usually involving calcium, as well as carbon and oxygen found in corals and mollusks, as well as in limestone rocks. Okay, so just to kind of zoom in on this diagram of hydrocarbons. So if you look here, here's methane, and here's some other gases that are called natural gases, or much shorter carbon chains. Here are some of the carbon compounds inside crude oil, various sizes, and tar has really big molecules. These are all different kinds of molecules that can be found inside crude oil, inside tar, and natural gas. So big carbon chains, all little gray dots, of course, are carbon bonded together. And those bonds are where the energy is held. Okay, so in aquatic ecosystems, a lot of the time people don't think about the carbon in the water. So when we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's going to dissolve into the water. Just like oxygen dissolves into the water from the atmosphere, so does carbon dioxide. And it enters the water and is now dissolved carbon dioxide. Oftentimes, this will then react with water, and we get this hydrogen carbonate instead, okay, being produced right here. And so this can actually change the pH of the water. If there's too much of it, the water gets slightly acidic. And if you look here in my aquatic ecosystem, I have producers, of course, I'm going to have algae, and they need to have that carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis in the water. So it's important to have CO2 in the water, but not too much of it. Like everything in ecology, everything in biology has to be in equilibrium. Okay, and then we have when fish and things, when they respire, they're going to be producing carbon dioxide. And they're going to be taking in the oxygens also dissolved in the water, and that's not shown in this particular diagram. So keep that in mind when you're doing your carbon cycle, aquatic as well as terrestrial. Okay, let's talk about methane. So methane is the CH4 compound, and there's a certain type of bacteria, archaeans. So if you remember from talking about classification in topic 5, there's 3 domains. There's domain Eubacteria, domain Archaea, and domain Eukaryota. So archaeans are prokaryotic organisms. They're very ancient and kind of very different from bacteria in terms of their DNA and their evolution. They tend to live in more extreme environments, and some of them are called methanogens. So methanogens or methanogenic archaeans are ones that are able to produce methane. So an example here, an archaean might take in acetate, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen and produce methane gas out of that. So out of their regular metabolic process of those particular archaeans, they're going to produce methane. Now, a lot of the times they live in anaerobic environments. Remember, anaerobic means no oxygen. And they can't do their reactions if there is oxygen present. They are obligate anaerobes. And a lot of the time we get this particular environment in what's called a waterlogged soil. So what does that mean for soil being waterlogged? And why would waterlogging affect the aerobic or anaerobic quality of a soil environment? Think about it for a second. So in a waterlogged soil, that means all the normal gaps between the soil particles in the ground would be completely full of water. There's so much water, it can no longer be absorbed. So it's just kind of sitting on the top. And that means if all the pores in the soil are filled with water, that means none of the pores in the soil can be filled with air. So there is no air in the soil, which means we have no air, and it makes an anaerobic environment in which methanogens are able to do this process. Okay, so that methane being produced by the archaeans, it can be burned as a biofuel like we have here, if it's fermented first. But what else can we do with it, or where else does it tend to go? So methane can go 2 places. It can go into the atmosphere directly, just dissolve out of the soil, for example, into the atmosphere. It can also be buried underground. And then we get this methane as a natural gas deposit. Okay. All right, so here's another diagram kind of showing what happens when methane is produced in the earth when it enters the atmosphere. So here I have my methane molecule. Produce the Earth's surface, and we have different processes, but they have to be oxygen deficient processes, so anaerobic processes. So in things like rice paddies or wetlands, landfills, coal mine, natural gas, biomass burning, those kinds of processes are going to be anaerobic and then allow the production of methane. It's very common in the lower atmosphere, and then it's going to be transported up to the upper atmosphere. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the layers of the atmosphere, but the troposphere is a lower layer, and then they have a stratosphere above it, and the tropopause is this line about 12 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, where it switches from the troposphere to the stratosphere. So at this point, most of the water is not going to cross, so we end up having just methane up here because it's too cold. The higher you get, the colder it gets because there's less heat being reflected by the surface of the Earth to a certain extent. So once we're above this line up here, the higher part of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, one methane molecule is going to produce two waters. And water is a greenhouse gas. And the series of reactions that produces this is also going to produce some carbon dioxide. So when I release a methane, which is a greenhouse gas, it's going to react in the upper atmosphere to produce water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide, which is another greenhouse gas. So we have long-term increases in methane. Okay, so how are these fossil fuels formed? Well, hopefully you are fairly familiar with this already, that fossil fuels are formed over a very, very long time, millions of years, and that's a big part of why they're not sustainable, is it takes too long to replace them compared to the rate at which we're using them. They're formed from the very slow decomposition of carbon, and that carbon is stored in the bodies of organisms, plants most commonly, but also animals, other things. And that biomass has to be buried under very specific conditions to actually produce fossil fuels. Doesn't happen all the time. Okay, and those fossil fuels, if they're produced with high enough pressure, high enough temperature in the right aerobic or anaerobic environment for millions of years, it will then kind of accumulate and build up in a certain geological formation. So oil and natural gas kind of form up in porous rock, and peat and coal tend to form within layers of sediment. So I'm going to show you a diagram of these formations in a little bit. But they form in different processes over millions of years based on the properties of the environment where the organisms died and where this process began. When we burn fossil fuels, which is a very common energy source for vehicles, most people's cars run on gas. We burned coal or oil or natural gas to produce electricity. If you burn gas directly, I know my house, my stove runs on gas. I have a couple of gas tanks to run my stove to cook with. And then we burn biomass. We also release carbon dioxide. Why is it the same for both of these things? Pause the video and think with that for a second. What do biomass and fossil fuels have in common? Okay, so hopefully you are aware that biomass just means trees, plants, animals. And so when we burn those things, mostly it's woods, trees, that's the same carbon compounds are similar to what would be in a fossil fuel. So the wood, for example, has the carbon that is going to be burned and releasing carbon dioxide. And when we burn fossil fuels, it's that wood is an example of something that could become a fossil fuel if it's buried for long enough. It's going to still be making carbon, it's releasing carbon, but it's going to be in much larger chains. So you think back to, let's go back here to this big diagram of my fossil fuels. So oil, we have much, much larger chains here in oil than we do in gas. And in wood, they're shorter as well. Not as big. It's getting less energy, but it's still carbon compounds that are being burned and releasing that carbon dioxide. Okay, let's go back to where we were here. Okay, so here's the first diagram of how fossils are being produced, and this is oil and natural gas. So these two are produced often at the same time, the same way. And you should notice here the time frame, 300 to 400 million years. Wherever this oil deposit now was probably an ocean. And we have all these small organisms, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and as they die, they're going to fall down and accumulate in the sediment. And then over time, that sediment is going to be trapped by impenetrable rock, so it's going to cause it to be anaerobic inside there, and that's going to cause decomposition of those things in a very slow way with high pressure from all the weight of the sediment above and high temperatures as close to the center of the earth. And that over millions of years, over 300 to 400 millions of years, is going to produce oil now in that porous rock and some gas above it. Okay, for coal and peat, it's going to be similar. It takes less time, from 100 to 400 million years, instead of 3 to 400, it's only 100 to 400. But we're starting here not with an ocean, but with a swamp, with a wetland. So that when plants and things die, they're going to fall down and they're going to be in the water, and that's going to cause them to be in an anaerobic environment, and they're going to decompose slowly. Okay, and we have more sediment being built on top of it, and we have impenetrable rock layer kind of holding the accumulation together, and that's going to turn to peat. There are places, for example, in the UK where they still dig up peat today from bogs, and they bring it home and burn it as a fuel source. And the campfire burns very slow and very long as a very distinctive smell, but it is a fossil fuel. If we leave that for even longer, that takes about 100 million years, that even longer, then we can get that turning into coal. And much more pressures, a lot more sediment on top of this layer here, and we get a seam of coal deeper into the earth, and we can mine that out. In some cases, just take down entire mountaintops to access the coal. That happened in West Virginia quite a bit. Okay, let's go back to the ocean here, back to the water. So there's different marine organisms that are really important to the carbon cycle, and particular ones that have a hard carbon skeleton. So which ones can you think of that have a hard carbon skeleton? Well, corals, of course, in the picture here have a coral. So corals underneath them, that's all calcium carbonate skeleton. And then mollusks, so things like clams, mussels, now I want to have some seafood. Clams and mussels and scallops and all those kind of things, they have these hard shells that are made of carbon. So what happens is they take those hydrogen carbonate ions and calcium ions that are in the water, here we go, calcium and hydrogen carbonate, and they're going to bond them together to make calcium carbonate, which is a really strong molecule, and it can be used to make the shell and exoskeleton. So here the coral underneath the ground, here's a skeleton, and the living part is on top of it. And then in clams, of course, and other mollusks, it's the shell outside. Okay, now these are actually a pretty major sink for carbon. Coral reefs can store carbon for a very long time, and a lot of the time, big coral reefs, only the top layer is alive because they have to be able to photosynthesize. The bottom layers are not alive, and that's why they store all that carbon. So they convert it into stone over time. Now, when corals die, or that bottom kind of layers, or when clams and other mollusks, or snails, when they die, their shells are going to be layered up on the bottom of the ocean floor, and that will be converted into rocks. The process of converting kind of loose sediment, like skeletons or shells of mollusks and the bits of leftover coral reef, converting that to solid rock is called lithification. And in this case, it's going to always form what's called limestone. So limestone is another sink for carbon, and it's produced from the skeletons and of corals and mollusks, kind of compressing with pressure over time and turning into limestone. If you remember rock cycle from middle school, it's a sedimentary rock. Okay, so here is a table for you listing all the reservoirs, or lots of reservoirs of carbon, and here the process that moves carbon around. So it's equally important you know where carbon is stored, where it can be found, and how it moves between things. Just like any cycle, it's about moving between different places. So we have living plants that move carbon with photosynthesis, living animals move carbon with respiration, decomposers move carbon with decomposition, soils and organic molecules, we have carbon diffusing through them, we have fossil fuels storing carbon, but we can burn them through combustion, sedimentary rocks are formed through fossilization or lithification, corals and shellfish, they can get carbon through fossilization as well into the carbon cycle, feeding could be any live plant or live animal, if it's a live plant maybe it's a Venus flytrap. Erosion of rocks and volcanic eruptions are all can release carbon. Phytoplankton, of course, also does photosynthesis. Oceanic food webs would be the feeding part. Seawater is going to be diffusion of carbon from the atmosphere into the water. So I want you to take this table and I want you to use it to complete this diagram. So here are a whole bunch of different places where carbon is found, and I want you to add the arrows connecting it. If it goes from here to here, for example, which direction it's going, and then the process. So if living plants to the atmosphere, that's going to be photosynthesis. And add all of them you can. I've uploaded this picture as a screenshot image, so you can download it and use it. You can also just draw it in your notebook. It's up to you, but you need to make this and draw the arrows. So pause it, add the arrows, and process to this diagram. Okay, so here is one solution to this, and I want you to take a minute and double check your work and notice the direction here. So plants are doing respiration as well as photosynthesis. We're taking carbon into the process and putting it out with respiration. I have respiration from the live animals, which actually is not shown clearly, it should be here. Combustion from the little factory here, volcanic eruptions bringing it out. I have soils and peat, taking it from the living plants to the decomposers. I have sedimentary rocks becoming fossil fuels, corals and shellfish becoming sedimentary rocks through sedimentation. So double check your work. If you have any questions about this, please make a note and ask me next time we meet. Okay, so next class what you're going to be doing is you're not going to have a lesson, you're going to have a simulation assignment to do. It will be on this particular website. So you're going to be manipulating the change in fossil fuel use and the deforestation rate and seeing how that affects the carbon dioxide. You're also going to look here is the storage of carbon in gigatons of carbon. And you'll see how it's stored in terrestrial plants, in the soil, in coal, oil, and gas. And this is one block is 25 gigatons of carbon. That's the unit the IDU wants to use is gigatons. In the atmosphere, sometimes you'll see them talking about ppm, that's parts per million. But gigatons of carbon is GTC is the unit they want you to use. So that'll be coming to you next class. I'll try and post a little bit earlier so you can get started earlier if you would like to. Okay, so that is today's lesson. If you have any questions, please make a note and we'll talk about it next week. Hope everyone's home safe and this makes sense to you guys and not going too crazy, getting too bored. Have a good one. Bye.